I had always trusted her, or at least I thought I did. The business was something we built together, brick by brick, each step a partnership, each victory a shared moment. And I thought that trust extended beyond just the company. But that all changed the day I found the texts. It was late one evening, long after dinner, when I sat down to check some emails for the business. My wife, Emily, had left her phone unattended on the kitchen counter. Normally, I wouldn't even think to glance at it. But something tugged at me that night, something in my gut telling me to take a look. What I found froze me. Messages exchanged between her and someone named Brian, someone I had met a few times, always as a casual acquaintance. The conversation wasn't just friendly. It was flirtatious, suggestive, full of innuendos. Plans for secret meetings. All of it. The text made it clear this wasn't just some passing fling. This had been going on for months. I felt my heart sink to my stomach. Every word on that screen was a dagger to the trust one had built with her over the years. I should have been angry. I should have stormed in there, yelled, confronted her right then and there. But I didn't. No, I was too calm, too methodical. I was going to let her think I had no idea. I wasn't going to make a scene. Instead, I would take my time, plan this out, and when the time came, I would make sure she understood the full weight of her betrayal. The initial shock of discovering Emily's betrayal had subsided, replaced by something colder, more calculated. Anger wasn't what I felt. It was something deeper, more visceral. A gnawing sense of betrayal. Yes, but also a thirst for justice. A desire to make Emily feel the weight of her lies, her deceit. The truth was, I wasn't ready to just let her walk away from this. She had taken so much from me. Not just our marriage, but the trust we had built over the years, the business that was supposed to be our future. I spent the next few days in a haze of thought, replaying every moment of our relationship, searching for clues I might have missed. The discovery of the text felt like a sudden burst of clarity, like a light shining on all the dark corners of our life together, illuminating everything I had once believed to be true. But now I realized I was living in the shadow of something else entirely. What I had seen was just the tip of the iceberg. It took hours of sifting through the messages before I found a pattern. Brian and Emily had been planning their rendezvous for months, even coordinating them around the business trips I had taken. They had met at hotels and quiet cafes, in places I'd never think to look. At first, I was consumed with anger. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew that my response couldn't just be one of raw emotion. I had to outsmart her, make sure she understood the cost of her actions. Emily had no idea that I knew. She thought I was oblivious. That night, she had come home, kissed me on the cheek as usual, and even asked how my day had gone. Too normal, too perfect. I couldn't decide if I admired her ability to act so convincingly, or if it made the betrayal even worse. But I wasn't going to confront her yet. No, the plan had to unfold with precision. There were still too many loose ends. One thread of the story stood out to me. Brian's wife, Karen. She was the missing piece of this puzzle. I'd met Karen a handful of times over the years. She was always polite, quiet, the kind of person who blended into the background at parties and business events. She and Brian had seemed like a solid couple. And yet, here I was, learning that she was oblivious to the very thing that had been eating away at her marriage for months. I couldn't just leave it at that. Karen deserved to know. I had no intention of dragging her into this, but it seemed only fair. She was the victim, just as much as I was. She had been lied to, manipulated, and, just like me, she had been kept in the dark. It struck me then that I wasn't just going to expose Emily. I was going to expose them both. The plan was simple, but it had to be executed with finesse. I needed Karen's involvement, but I couldn't do it directly. If I confronted her, she might back out. But if I made her part of a bigger spectacle, if I could use her as the tool to bring everything to light, then the truth would hurt 1,000 times more. I sat down one afternoon, composing a message. It was formal, polite, and subtly calculated. I invited Karen to a business dinner, one I was hosting with a few other colleagues. Emily, of course, would be thrilled to plan and organize it. She had always been the social one, the one who loved entertaining. I smiled at the irony of it all. She would play a part in bringing her own downfall to the surface. The invitation was sent with no expectation that Karen would say yes. But to my surprise, she replied within a day, agreeing to attend. I could see the unease in her response, but there was no way she could back out now. The dinner would be the perfect setting for my plan. Emily would never suspect a thing. She'd be too focused on the logistics of the event. Karen would walk right into the trap. Days passed, and the night of the dinner drew closer. I spent hours planning every detail. Emily, in her excitement, took charge of everything, deciding on the menu, organizing the guest list, preparing the drinks, as if nothing was amiss. Meanwhile, I made sure the atmosphere of the evening would reflect the perfect amount of tension. It had to be subtle, a slow burn. Nothing overt, just enough to keep everyone on edge. As I watched her work, a sick feeling twisted in my stomach. She was doing exactly what she'd done for months, smiling, acting as though everything was fine. She had no idea that I was watching her every move, that I had become the silent observer in our own life. But I couldn't let my emotions show. Not yet. This wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure that Emily understood the consequences of her actions. This was about justice, about restoring the balance that had been shattered. She had thought she could get away with this. I was going to make sure she didn't. The day before the dinner, I contacted Brian's wife again, this time asking if she had any dietary preferences for the meal. I could tell she was still nervous, but also curious. She probably assumed it was just a polite gesture, but I knew the truth. We both knew the truth, even if we hadn't said it yet. On the night of the event, I kept a cool, calm demeanor. Emily was in her element, greeting guests, chatting, setting everything up as if she hadn't betrayed me. I watched her, and the anger that had simmered for days began to bubble up again. This was the moment, I told myself. I made sure to watch Brian's every move as well. He was quieter than usual, his eyes darting around the room as if he could sense that something was off. He was used to lying, but tonight his lie would unravel. As the guests arrived, I felt the first stirrings of satisfaction. Emily had no idea she was about to become the centerpiece of her own undoing. The night stretched on. The small talk, the polite laughter, the clinking of glasses, it was all just noise to me now. I could feel the weight of the plan pressing down on me. Every word that left my mouth, every gesture was carefully calculated. But it was Karen's arrival that was the final piece of the puzzle. She stepped into the room, her eyes scanning the crowd. She was greeted by Emily with an easy smile, unaware of what was about to unfold. Emily seemed completely oblivious. She never saw it coming, and that's when I realized something important. This wasn't just about punishing her. It was about taking back control. It was about reclaiming my life from the hands of the woman who had betrayed me and showing her that I was not the man she thought I was. And in that moment, I was ready. The night had arrived. The party was set, the guests were gathering, and the atmosphere was as heavy as I had imagined. I stood in the middle of the room, watching Emily and her perfect little world come to life. She was in her element, effortlessly charming everyone, pouring wine, directing people to the hors d'oeuvres, making everything seem normal, while I stood there, feeling the weight of my own betrayal. Emily had no idea. I watched her with a strange mix of resentment and curiosity. She was so convincing in her role as the doting wife, the perfect hostess. She was playing her part well, and it was both sickening and impressive. She had no clue that tonight her role was going to end. The curtains were about to fall, and she would never again be able to hide behind her charm and the perfect image we had built together. I looked around the room, noting the guests who had arrived, business associates, mutual friends, people who had no idea what was really going on behind the scenes. The chatter of polite conversation filled the air, but beneath the surface, there was something electric, something charged with tension. I could feel it, even if no one else could. The night was going to end differently than anyone expected. As the evening wore on, I kept a sharp eye on Brian. He was playing his role too, nodding politely, laughing at jokes, but his eyes were always darting around the room, as if he was waiting for something. I knew that he knew something was off. There had been too many glances exchanged between Emily and me. He could feel the tension, but he didn't know the extent of what was coming. Then Karen arrived. I had already made my entrance, made my presence known, but when Karen stepped through the door, something shifted. It was subtle at first, the way her eyes scanned the room, the uncertainty in her steps as she took in the faces around her. She was trying to hide it, but I could see the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. She had no idea, of course, what was waiting for her. But I could sense it, the moment the realization would hit her. That moment was approaching fast. Emily greeted Karen with her usual warmth, introducing her to some of the other guests, making small talk as if everything was completely normal. Karen was polite, but clearly a bit on edge, likely due to the formality of the event. She wasn't used to being around this many business people, but she tried to keep up. I could see her glancing around the room, looking for familiar faces, trying to settle into the evening. Meanwhile, I stayed calm. There was no sign of panic on my face. My role tonight was simple: to observe, to make sure everything went according to plan. My every word, every smile, every nod to the other guests, it was all part of the act. I was still the businessman, the host, the man who had everything under control. Little did they know, control had already slipped through my fingers, and I was simply waiting for the moment to unleash the truth. As the night continued, the tension between Emily and me grew thicker. I could feel her unease, the subtle shifts in her behavior as she tried to read me. Her mind was racing, but she couldn't figure it out. Not yet. She had no idea that I had already seen everything, heard everything about her affair. But I didn't let it show. I was careful, making sure I didn't give anything away. I spoke to the other guests, complimenting them on their achievements, pretending like everything was perfectly fine. But underneath, everything was a storm. I could feel it building. The moment was coming. Then came the first hint of trouble. Emily and Brian had been talking, laughing together, just like old friends. But there was something off about their interaction. I could see it in Brian's eyes. He was nervous. He wasn't his usual self. His shoulders were tense, his smile strained. Emily, of course, was too busy trying to keep up appearances to notice. But I noticed, and I couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. At one point, I even caught Emily looking at me from across the room, her gaze lingering just a little too long, her lips parting as though she was trying to figure me out. I could feel the discomfort in the air. I knew she was beginning to sense that something was off, but she couldn't put her finger on it. The trap was set, and she was walking right into it. It wasn't until the dinner was halfway through that the real tension began to seep into the room. Brian had begun to grow more restless, shifting in his seat as if the walls were closing in. Emily continued to smile, oblivious to what was happening, and Karen seemed to be getting more uneasy by the minute. I noticed the slight trembling of her hand as she picked up her glass of wine, the way she fidgeted with her napkin. She was probably wondering why the evening felt off. But no one could have guessed what was coming next. I decided it was time. I stood up and cleared my throat, signaling to everyone that I was about to say a few words. The guests grew silent, their attention on me. Emily glanced at me, a small smile on her face, clearly unaware that everything was about to change. She had no idea how close the end was, how close we were to the breaking point. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice steady. I'd like to take a moment to thank you all for being here tonight. It's always a pleasure to share a meal and good company. But there is something important that we need to address before we continue. I could see the confusion in their faces, the way they all looked at one another, unsure of what I was about to say. Even Emily's smile faltered slightly, but she didn't question it. She had no idea what I was about to do. I'd like to thank Emily for all her hard work in putting this event together. I continued, my voice carrying the right amount of sincerity. But there's something she doesn't know, something that needs to be said. The room fell silent. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind racing to catch up. She must have thought I was joking, or perhaps she was hoping it was just a random comment, a passing remark. But she didn't know me. Not anymore. I'm sure many of you have heard of the strong partnership we've built, both in business and in life. I went on, my gaze shifting to Brian, whose face had gone pale. What Emily doesn't know is that while we've been working together on our future, someone else has been working on something else entirely behind my back. And what I'm about to share will not only shatter our personal relationship, but it will also affect the business that we've built together. Emily's face went from confusion to disbelief, and then to shock. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Brian, on the other hand, looked like he might pass out right there. His eyes darted to Karen, who was staring at him, the realization hitting her like a slap to the face. "Emily, I know about you and Brian," I said, my voice quiet but cutting through the room like a knife. "I know about your affair. I know about the lies, the deceit, and I'm sure Karen would like to know as well." The room exploded in murmurs. Emily stood frozen, her face pale, her lips trembling. Brian, for the first time all night, looked terrified. But it was Karen's reaction that took me by surprise. She wasn't just upset. She was furious. Her face twisted in anger, her voice breaking as she stood up. "How could you?" She shouted at Brian, her voice shaking with betrayal. "How could you do this to me? All these years." The tension in the room was unbearable. Emily's world was crashing down. She was no longer in control. And as Karen turned away from Brian, storming out of the room, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The storm had arrived, and it was no longer my responsibility to shield her from the consequences. I waited until the final speech. As the night was winding down, I stood up and raised my glass. Everyone fell silent. The room was full of anticipation, except for Emily, who was growing visibly uncomfortable. "I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight," I began. "But there's one last thing I need to say, something that's been weighing heavily on me." Emily's face went white. Brian shifted uncomfortably beside her, and Karen looked at me confused. "Emily," I said, my voice steady, my eyes locking with hers, "I've come to realize that there are some things in life you can't ignore. Some truths are impossible to hide, no matter how hard you try." The room grew even quieter. "You've betrayed me, Emily. You've been seeing Brian for months, and it's not just a personal betrayal. You've dragged our business into this mess. I hope you understand the depth of what you've done." The room went silent. Emily looked at me wide-eyed, her mouth opening and closing in shock. But it wasn't just Emily I was speaking to. I turned to Brian. "And Brian," I said, "I suppose you thought I didn't know, but the truth always comes out, doesn't it? I'm sure Karen here will appreciate hearing about your little affair." Karen's face shifted from confusion to horror. She turned to Brian, the realization hitting her like a slap. Her eyes filled with tears, and the room buzzed with the tension of 1,000 unspoken words. Karen's voice cracked as she turned to her husband. "How could you? How could you do this to me?" The final blow came when Karen tore into Brian. She ripped him apart in front of everyone, her rage and heartbreak raw and exposed. And in that moment, Emily knew. She knew exactly what I had done. The night was over. People left in whispers, but none of the stares from the guests had as much weight as the silence that hung between Emily and me. When everyone was gone, she approached me, her eyes desperate. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. Please don't leave me." But I wasn't listening to her words anymore. I was done. My heart had shattered, and no amount of apologies or tears would fix what she had done. "We're done, Emily," I said quietly. "What we had, it's gone. I can't rebuild that." She begged me, but there was no point. I had already made up my mind. A few days later, Karen filed for divorce from Brian. And soon after, Emily left too, packing up her things. As she walked out the door, I felt a strange weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel victorious. But I did feel something I hadn't felt in months: freedom. I spent the following months putting my life back together. The business was still there, but now it was mine, truly mine. I threw myself into it, finding joy in the work that had once been a burden. I picked up new hobbies, reconnected with friends I'd neglected, and began to heal. I learned that sometimes it's only through betrayal that we find the courage to move forward. The pain was real, but it wasn't forever. I had been broken, but in that brokenness, I found a strength I never knew I had. And as for Emily and Brian, their betrayal had shown me one thing: trust is earned, not given. And once it's broken, there's no going back. In the end, I learned that we all have the power to rebuild, no matter how much we've lost. The hardest part is simply choosing to start again.